Hi everyone, it's Dr. Fox. Let's talk about the principal lymph nodes and pathways, part 1. In this video, we'll describe the general pattern of the flow of lymph from lymphatic capillaries to ducts, noting the regions served and the vessels followed, with a special emphasis on nodes of the root of the neck, nodes of the head and neck, nodes of the thorax, both pulmonary as well as axilla and breast, and then finally, nodes of the upper limb. Let's first start with the general organization of lymphatics. Lymphatics begin in specialized capillaries called lymphatic capillaries. These capillaries are embedded within the capillaries of the cardiovascular system, although they are not a part of it. So they're interwoven or enmeshed around it, such that they may receive any of the excess plasma filtrate that leaves the cardiovascular system into the interstitial tissue, but does not return back to the cardiovascular system. The lymph gets picked up by these lymphatic capillaries and is carried by lymphatic vessels as they move the lymph back toward the thoracic venous circulation. Along the way, these lymphatic vessels filter the lymph through lymph nodes. And it's here where we have the opportunity of bringing pathogens along with their antigens into contact with lymphocytes as well as antigen-presenting cells such that we can have immune responses. Oftentimes, an immune response will present as lymphadenopathy, and that lymph node will be slightly tender, slightly mobile, and oftentimes found on both sides of the body, meaning bilateral. Metastases may also be found within lymph nodes. In particular, carcinomas or cancers from epithelial tissues may move or spread lymphogenously through the lymphatic system, in which case, as mets appear within a lymph node, that lymph node tends to be more firm and fixed, so it's not very mobile or squishy under the skin, and typically it only presents unilaterally on one side of the body. Now, as vessels conduct through lymph nodes, they then are going to coalesce into lymphatic trunks. Lymphatic trunks are oftentimes named by their association with other anatomical structures. So, for instance, there might be superficial and deep cervical nodes that are of the neck. Lymphatic trunks will coalesce into lymphatic ducts. And there are two. There's one on the right side that feeds into the right venous angle called the right lymphatic duct. And there's one on the left side that feeds into the left venous angle called the thoracic duct. And a venous angle is simply where the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein come together before the brachiocephalic vein. And so when we say in the vicinity, what we mean is somewhere into either the distal IJV, subclavian vein, or the proximal brachiocephalic vein. And we can see those venous angles here on this illustration. So let's take a gander at some of the principal groups of nodes. And in particular, of this video, we'll focus on the root of the neck, the head and neck, nodes of the thorax, as well as the upper limb and axilla. So let's begin with the root of the neck, which for the flow of lymph is the end of the story. But I think that it's very helpful to understand this so that we can see the great pattern of drainage. So there are two ducts here. There is a right lymphatic duct, which is feeding into the right venous angle, which we can see there, and a thoracic duct, which is feeding into the left venous angle, which we can see there. So we've got those two venous angles that receive the ducts, and the ducts will each receive a series of trunks. So when we look at, let's start with the right lymphatic duct. So here, ascending the thorax on either side is the bronchomediastinal trunk. You can see it coming up around there. There's the jugular trunk coming down against the internal jugular vein, and the subclavian trunk coming down along the subclavian vein. So jugular, subclavian, and bronchomediastinal trunks are all feeding into the right lymphatic duct on the right side. We also have those same trunks on the left side feeding into the thoracic duct. But let's begin our tale of the thoracic duct more proximally. So below the level of the diaphragm, so there's the diaphragm there, typically tucked up closer, is a dilation of this vessel called the cisterna chyli. And the cisterna chyli is going to receive lymph from basically everything inferior to the diaphragm. So all of the lumbar nodes, all of the nodes of the viscera, everything that's coming up from the lower limbs and the pelvis, all of that feeds into the cisterna chyli. That cisterna chyli is really the proximal dilation of the thoracic duct. So it's at the beginning of it. And the thoracic duct is going to ascend in the posterior mediastinum. It's typically on the left side, and then it crosses over from the left to the right at about the thoracic plane, and it goes behind the subclavian vasculature, and it's going into the vicinity of that left venous angle. And along the way, it will pick up the left bronchomediastinal trunk. It will pick up the left jugular trunk. It will pick up the left subclavian trunk. Now, the last thing to say about either of these two vessels is that the trunks that feed into the ducts may enter any of those veins independently. We just teach that they coalesce into the ducts, but there's a lot of variation. Veins are variable, and therefore the lymphatic vessels and trunks that receive those vessels are also variable. If we look at this person here, we can see how there is a very special pattern of lymphatic drainage whereby the right upper limb, the right thorax, and the right head and neck are all drained by the right lymphatic duct. Whereas everything else, the abdominal pelvic area, the lower limbs, the left upper limb, the left head and neck are all drained by the thoracic duct. So that's why we get that very unique pattern of drainage there. So let's take a look at some of the local lymph groups, and let's start with the lymphatics of the head and neck. So we've talked a little bit about Waldeyer's ring. So that's the ring of lymphatic nodules surrounding the pharynx. So this is found in both the naso and oropharyngeal regions. Waldeyer's ring is going to drain into the superior deep cervical nodes. So the superior deep cervical nodes are right there. Waldeyer's ring is right around there, and so we've got drainage there. There is a specialized node within there. It's the purple one called the jugulodigastric node. The jugulodigastric node is one of those sentinel nodes that tends to be enlarged whenever someone has an upper respiratory infection, in this case, a strep infection. And what happens is it really pops, and that's why when someone is palpating your neck and they're saying, "I'm feeling for your glands," they're not feeling for glands, they're palpating for lymph adenovirus. So I want to draw your attention to, there are two vessels here. There's this internal jugular vein and an external jugular vein. It's not very obvious here, but the internal jugular vein is deep, the external jugular vein is superficial. And so those deep cervical nodes are in association with the IJV. So there's a superior group that includes the jugulodigastric node, and then there's an inferior group coming all the way down. So basically all of this stuff there, which includes a supraclavicular node. And these two are divided by the intermediate tendon of the omohyoid muscle. So omohyoid muscle goes from the, that's a really terrible drawing of it, I'm sorry. Omohyoid muscle goes, it's from the thyroid cartilage, and then there's an intermediate tendon, and it goes back to the shoulder blade. So this should be located down there. So that divides superior from inferior deep cervical nodes. I bring up that supraclavicular node because that is another sentinel node. In particular, gastric cancers, so malignancies of the stomach, can metastasize. And one of the first indications of that a person will realize is that they have a firm, fixed, painless mass above their left clavicle. And so oftentimes we call that supraclavicular node on the left side Virchow's node, after Rudolf Virchow. So that that's an early indication of a gastric malignancy. So let's move down to the thorax, and we're going to start our study more deeply. So here we can see the lungs within the pulmonary cavity, and we can see some of the conductive pathways of the tracheobronchial tree here in blue, which move air to and from the lungs. So out within the parenchyma of the lungs, we have pulmonary nodes. That's named very well. And pulmonary nodes are going to drain into bronchopulmonary nodes. Bronchopulmonary nodes, as number 1 here, are found in the hilum of the lungs. So I'll circle that, and now let me erase it so that it's not in the way. And what happens is lymph from bronchopulmonary nodes will move into tracheobronchial nodes. There's both inferior tracheobronchial nodes, that's below the bifurcation of the primary bronchi, and then there are superior tracheobronchial nodes above the bifurcation of the primary bronchi. And you can have movement of lymph from inferior to superior. So we're ascending here up through the mediastinum. From these tracheobronchial nodes, we have movement of lymph along the bronchomediastinal trunks. And as the bronchomediastinal trunks ascend, they're going to feed either on the right side into the right lymphatic duct or the left side into the thoracic duct. Now let's look at a more superficial collection of nodes of the thorax, and this is of particular importance insofar as metastasis of breast cancer. So let's start here at 0. This is the subareolar lymphatic plexus. So that's within the breast, deep to the areola. At the subareolar plexus, 3/4 of that lymph, 75%, will move to the axillary group, whereas 1/4, 25%, will move to either peristernal nodes or the contralateral breast. Let's take a look at the 3/4 that are moving to the axillary group. Now, axillary references the axilla, or the armpit. So the first group of nodes are the pectoral nodes. These are deep to pec major, kind of at the margin of pec major. And from there, lymph will ascend up to the central nodes, and from the central nodes to the apical nodes, which are at the apex of the axilla. And then from the apical nodes, lymph will drain into the subclavian trunk. On the right side, draining into the right lymphatic duct. On the left side, the thoracic duct. Now let's go back and see what happens when the lymph moves to the peristernal nodes or the contralateral breast. It's a significantly more parsimonious pathway. Peristernals move to the bronchomediastinal trunk. The bronchomediastinal trunk on the right goes to the right lymphatic duct. On the left, it goes to the thoracic duct. Any lymph from the contralateral breast is then going to move through those axillary nodes, the pectorals, the centrals, the apicals, then the subclavian trunks, and then to the associated duct. Now finally, let's look at the flow of lymph in the upper limbs. So there's going to be both superficial and deep. Recall the general pathways and associations. So deep lymphatics are in association with arteries. Superficial lymphatics typically follow veins. And so the deep lymphatics following the arteries ascend, and then they're going to feed into the axillary group, specifically the humoral nodes, then into the centrals, then into the apicals, then into the subclavian trunk, and then into the associated duct. Whereas the superficial lymphatics will follow things like the cephalic and basilic veins, which then eventually flow into the apical, axillary nodes, and then into the subclavian trunk before going to the duct. So let us test our knowledge here. Most lymph drained from regions inferior to the diaphragm will pass through the blank before returning to venous circulation by way of which vessel? Well, everything inferior to the diaphragm passes through the cisterna chyli, and the cisterna chyli is the proximal dilation of the thoracic duct. So D is the correct answer. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in part 2. Take care.